Jack the Ripper, Sleep Story. Introduction. Settling into the mystery. To further set the mood, imagine the era's sounds, the faint tolling of church bells, the distant whistles of steam locomotives, and the murmur of markets. London, in the late 1800s, was a city transitioning into modernity. The Industrial Revolution had brought factories that belched smoke into the sky and created jobs but also swelled the population. The wealth generated in the West End led to grand avenues lined with glittering shops, while the East End saw overcrowded tenements and impoverished workers living in squalid conditions. People from the countryside flooded into cities, hoping for work, only to find themselves competing for low wages. The Thames River, always busy, carried not only cargo, but also the hopes and sorrows of those who lived along its banks. The flicker of gas lamps provided both light and shadow, casting eerie silhouettes that played tricks on the eyes. Street vendors shouted their wares, hot chestnuts, fresh eels, while children darted between carts, laughing and squealing. Crime existed in the margins, unnoticed by those of means until a series of brutal murders shocked the world. Tonight, as you settle under your covers and close your eyes, allow me to take you back to the late 19th century. Imagine yourself walking along the damp cobblestones of London's East End in the autumn of 1888. Gas lamps flicker in the night. The air carries the scent of coal smoke and rain. Fog hangs low over narrow alleyways as horses' hooves clatter against uneven stones. It is a place of contrasts, of wealth and poverty, of opulence in the West End and destitution in the East. Amid this environment, a shadowy figure would emerge who would haunt the public imagination for more than a century. Before we begin, breathe deeply and settle in. Our journey will be gentle, thoughtful, and slow. A true crime tale, designed not to shock but to lull you into a state of rest. We'll explore the people and places involved and savor the details, always mindful of the humanity at the heart of this mystery. Setting the scene. The East End in 1888. The East End's maze of alleyways and courts hid entire communities. Narrow lanes like Dorset Street, known as one of the worst streets in London, were lined with doss houses where people could rent a bed for a few pennies a night. The buildings were packed so tightly that little sunlight reached the rooms inside, and ventilation was poor. Outbreaks of diseases such as cholera and typhus were common. The streets were often muddy because sewage and water drained poorly, and public sanitation infrastructure had not kept up with the city's growth. Residents relied on water pumps that were sometimes contaminated. Many families lived in a single room. Parents and children slept together, cooked together, and endured freezing winters and oppressive summers side by side. The air smelled of rotting refuse, coal smoke, and stale food. Amid this adversity, a sense of community thrived. Neighbors helped one another. Women shared childcare duties. Men formed informal networks for seeking work. When the murders began, this fabric of shared hardship was stretched thin by fear. Immigration and xenophobia also shaped Whitechapel. Newly arrived Jews, escaping pogroms in Russia and Poland, brought their traditions, languages, and foods. They opened small businesses, such as tailoring shops and bakeries, and built synagogues. But their presence aroused suspicion among some longer-standing residents. When newspapers whispered that the killer might be a foreigner, tension flared. Anti-Semitic graffiti appeared, and mobs threatened violence. Against this backdrop, the murders took on a social dimension, representing not only a series of crimes but also a flashpoint for existing prejudices and anxieties. Prostitution in Whitechapel was a complex phenomenon. The lack of social safety nets meant that women often had to choose between starvation and selling sex. Some, like Mary Ann Nichols, drifted in and out of prostitution when jobs as seamstresses or domestic servants were unavailable. Others relied on casual sex work to supplement their incomes. Victorian society stigmatized these women harshly, branding them immoral even as economic forces left them few choices. Police records and coroners' inquests often reflected this bias, referring to women by terms like unfortunate or depraved. Recent historians challenge these labels and highlight the resilience and humanity of women who navigated such a harsh environment. To understand the story of Jack the Ripper, we must first appreciate the world in which his crimes took place. By 1888, the East End district of Whitechapel had become a crowded, grimy warren of lodging houses, factories, and tenements. Thousands of immigrants had flocked here in search of work, including Jews fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe and laborers from across Britain. Overcrowding and poverty were severe. Work was scarce and many families lived several to a room. London's East End was viewed with either compassion or contempt. It was home to skilled immigrants but was also notorious for squalor and crime. Prostitution in Victorian London was technically illegal, only if it caused a public disturbance, and thousands of brothels and low-rent lodging houses provided sexual services. The death or assault of a working woman rarely made the news, yet the East End's violent undercurrent meant that ladies of the night were subject to physical attacks, sometimes resulting in death. Many of the women who will appear in our story were forced into sex work by economic hardship. Recent scholarship notes that the canonical victims were not all full-time prostitutes. Historian Hallie Rubenhold argues that only Mary Jane Kelly could be verified as a sex worker, while the others may have solicited occasionally or not at all, a point that challenges long-held biases. As you listen, remember that each of these women was more than a victim. She was someone's daughter, sister, friend, or mother. The first victim, Mary Ann Nichols. Mary Ann Nichols was born in 1845 in London. As a girl, she worked as a servant and married William Nichols, a printer's machinist, in 1864. Together they had 5 children. For a time, the family lived in modest comfort. Later, Mary Ann began to struggle with alcoholism. She left her husband multiple times, and eventually their marriage broke down. After leaving him permanently in 1881, she entered the workhouse system, moving from one institution to another. In those days, workhouses housed the destitute, providing basic shelter in exchange for labor under strict conditions. Mary Ann's father occasionally tried to help her, but she drifted away from her family. She found lodging in Flower and Dean Street, one of the most notorious streets in Whitechapel, and began to drink heavily. Despite this, friends described her as cheerful, when sober and fond of singing. On the night she died, she had been paid for cleaning a house and spent some of the money on alcohol. She was turned away from her lodging house because she lacked the 4pence needed for a bed. She told the lodging house deputy, "I'll soon get my doss money. See what a jolly bonnet I've got now." showing off a hat she had found. She then disappeared into the night. Hours later, her body was discovered by two carters on their way to work. The time between being turned away and being found was short, suggesting she met her killer very close to the lodging house. As you visualize Mary Ann's life, consider the resilience required to survive on the margins and the vulnerability created by poverty. Our story begins in the early hours of August 31st, 1888. Mary Ann Nichols, often called Polly, was discovered at around 3:40 a.m. in Bucks Row, Whitechapel. She was 42 years old and had 5 children. Despite being estranged from her husband, she remained devoted to her children and struggled to support herself. She spent many nights in common lodging houses and sometimes earned a few pennies through casual labor. On that rainy August morning, her throat had been deeply cut and her abdomen slashed. Her injuries suggested the killer possessed anatomical knowledge. According to research starters on Jack the Ripper, Mary Ann's head was nearly severed and her stomach was opened. Imagine the mist hovering over Bucks Row and the soft footfalls of the police constable who stumbled upon her body. The discovery did not yet portend the terror to come. Violent deaths were tragically common in Whitechapel. Still, whispers began to travel from lodging house to lodging house. There was something particularly unsettling about Polly's wounds. People wondered whether a madman or a surgeon could have inflicted them. As you breathe slowly, picture the quiet that settled back over the alley once the body was removed. The cobblestones would soon be washed, the bustle of the city would resume, and yet an eerie trace of horror remained. Annie Chapman, the second murder. Annie Chapman, born Eliza Ann Smith, came from a family with stable roots. Her father was a soldier in the Foot Guards, and the family moved several times during her childhood. She married John Chapman, a coachman, in 1869. They had 3 children, but tragedy struck when their only son died of meningitis and one of their daughters was born disabled. Both parents struggled with alcoholism, and their marriage deteriorated. They separated around 1884. After the separation, Annie drifted into casual work, including crochet and selling flowers. She occasionally stayed in a lodging house on Dorset Street with a man called John Simpson, known as the pensioner. Friends called her Dark Annie because of her dark brown hair. On the night before she died, witnesses saw her trying to earn money in the 10 Bells pub. She was last seen talking to a man in a dark overcoat and deerstalker hat. Neighbors in Hanbury Street later testified that they heard a woman's voice say, "No," shortly before the discovery. The killer had taken gruesome trophies from her body, leading investigators to speculate that he possessed anatomical knowledge. Despite this, the coroner's report noted that the wounds could have been made by anyone with a sharp knife. Annie's tragic end echoed a pattern of women trapped by addiction and poverty who fell through the cracks of Victorian society. Just 8 days later, on September 8, 1888, 47-year-old Annie Chapman was found dead in a yard behind 29 Hanbury Street. Annie was born into a respectable family, married a coachman, and had children, but she eventually separated from her husband and experienced financial troubles. Like many women in Whitechapel, she sold flowers or matches and sometimes cleaned rooms to earn enough money for a bed. When the public saw her belongings laid out beside her body, They realized that the killer had taken time. The research starters describe how, like Nichols, Chapman's head was nearly severed and her abdomen ripped open. Pieces of her skin were placed on her left shoulder, her intestines draped over her right, and parts of her bladder and reproductive organs were missing. While we will not linger on grisly details, we acknowledge these facts so that we comprehend the scale of the violence and the fear that gripped the neighborhood. That morning, the courtyard at Hanbury Street filled with onlookers. Some wept, others whispered accusations. Many criticized the police for failing to protect the vulnerable women of Whitechapel. Yet as the hours passed and the sun climbed higher, the noise of London resumed. Vendors hawked goods, children played in alleys. Life continued, albeit under a cloud of dread. When you breathe in now, imagine the weight of that dread mixing with autumn's sense of coal smoke and damp earth. The double event, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. The killer struck again 3 weeks later, not once but twice, in what would be dubbed the double event. In the early hours of September 30th, 1888, the body of Elizabeth Stride was discovered on Berner Street around 1 a.m. Elizabeth, a 43-year-old Swedish immigrant sometimes called Long Liz, had endured an unhappy marriage and years of poverty. She took in sewing and cleaned houses, and she occasionally engaged in sex work. Unlike the previous murders, Stride's wounds were less severe. She had one deep slash across her throat, but little mutilation. This led police to speculate that the killer might have been interrupted. Perhaps a footstep or carriage spooked him. Imagine the murderer, hidden in the shadows of the narrow street, hearing an approaching cart and slipping away into the night. Less than an hour later, about a half-mile away in Mitre Square, the killer struck again. The victim this time was Catherine Eddowes, a 46-year-old mother who occasionally sold trinkets or worked at brick factories. She had recently been arrested for drunkenness and was released just after midnight. According to research starters, she was found with her throat slashed and abdomen ripped open. The killer also sliced her eyelids and cut parts of her nose and right ear. A chalked message reading, "The Jews are not the men to be blamed for nothing," was found on a wall near the murder site. Authorities were unsure whether the graffiti was connected to the crime, but its presence intensified tensions between local residents and immigrant communities. The double event terrified London. Newspapers printed lurid headlines, merchants closed shops early, vigilante groups roamed the streets with clubs and whistles. Meanwhile, police constables scoured alleys by lamplight, their boots splashing through puddles. You might imagine them carrying lanterns, searching doorways, listening for whispers behind curtains. Despite their efforts, they found no culprit. The final canonical victim, Mary Jane Kelly. Mary Jane Kelly remains the most enigmatic of the canonical victims. Born around 1863, she grew up in Ireland, possibly in County Limerick or County Tipperary. She married a coal miner named Davies and later moved to Wales. After her husband died in a mining accident, she worked as a barmaid and may have turned to prostitution. She reportedly spent time in Paris working at a high-class brothel before returning to London and adopting the name Mary Jane Kelly. She had a quick wit and liked to speak in Irish when drinking. Neighbors described her as attractive, with auburn hair and a fair complexion. She met Joseph Barnett, a fish porter, and they lived together at Miller's Court. Barnett supported Mary Jane for a time, but the couple quarreled and separated shortly before her death. Barnett said they remained friends and that Mary Jane allowed other sex workers to sleep in her room. Her murder stands apart because it occurred indoors, in the cramped single-room dwelling. The killer had privacy and time. The brutality of the mutilations reflected unchecked rage. The scene was so horrifying that many officers refused to describe it. In expanding this part of the story, we can reflect on the vulnerability created by Mary Jane's isolation and the deep sense of violation felt by the community after learning of her fate. After the frenzy of late September, a strange calm fell over Whitechapel. A month passed without another murder. Many hoped the killer had left the city or perished. But on November 9, 1888, the most brutal killing yet shattered any sense of safety. Mary Jane Kelly, believed to be about 25 years old, was found dead in her small room at 13 Miller's Court. Mary Jane was Irish-born and had moved to London several years earlier. She was well liked at her lodging house and sometimes sang Irish ballads for friends. Among the canonical five, Mary Jane was the only victim clearly engaged in sex work. The scene inside Mary Jane's room horrified even hardened detectives. According to EBSCO's research summary, her body had been skinned and gutted. Pieces of her face and chest were removed and placed on a nearby table. Her heart was cut out and her intestines hung over a picture frame. We will not dwell on those details. Instead, imagine Mary Jane as she might have been before that night. Perhaps she sat near a small fire, warming her hands. Perhaps she dreamt of returning to Ireland. Her death marked the end of the Ripper's official spree. There were no further murders conclusively attributed to him. For years, Whitechapel residents whispered that he would return. But he never did. His sudden disappearance only deepened the mystery. Letters from the killer. The birth of Jack the Ripper. The letters attributed to Jack the Ripper became part of Victorian folklore. In addition to the Dear Boss and Saucy Jackie messages, hundreds of other letters poured into newspaper offices and police stations. Many were written in red ink to mimic blood, as if imitating the sensational details of the original. Some included crude drawings, while others claimed inside knowledge of the crimes. The public devoured these letters, and newspapers published them to boost sales. Literate members of society, who otherwise might not have paid attention to the plight of East End sex workers, became morbidly fascinated. The postal system of the time was efficient. Letters could be delivered several times a day within London. This allowed copycat writers to respond quickly to news reports. The Dear Boss letter itself used mockingly playful language, calling the police clever and threatening to send the victim's ears. It read in part, "I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. My knife's so nice and sharp I want to get to work right away if I get a chance." The letter promised a double event soon, which many believe referred to the murders of Stride and Eddowes. The Saucy Jackie postcard, postmarked October 1st, warned, "You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow." Double event this time. Number 1 squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off. The From Hell letter, delivered to George Lusk, was shorter and less articulate. It contained grammatical errors and misspellings and read, "From Hell, Mr. Lusk, sorry I send you half the kidney I took from one woman. I fried and ate it. It was very nice. The kidney that accompanied the letter was preserved in spirits. Medical examination suggested it was a human kidney with Bright's disease, a condition from which Catherine Eddowes suffered. Despite this, skeptics argue that obtaining a kidney from a medical student would have been possible. These letters reveal not only the writer's intent to shock, but also Victorian society's appetite for sensationalism. Press coverage of the letters turned the murderer into a mythological figure. Cartoonists depicted a cloaked man wielding a knife, lurking in foggy streets. Penny dreadfuls, cheap booklets containing lurid stories, sold out. The letters also influenced police strategy. Inspectors looked for similar handwriting, considered the literacy level of suspects, and even consulted graphologists. The involvement of a journalist in creating the letters speaks to the blurred line between news and entertainment. Today, the letters are preserved at the Metropolitan Police Museum and often displayed in exhibitions, reminding us of the interplay between crime and media. During the autumn of 1888, letters began arriving at newspapers and police stations. Most were hoaxes, but 3 stood out. The first, known as the Dear Boss letter, was received by the Central News Agency on September 27, 1888. It was written in a boastful tone and addressed to The Boss, Central News Office, London City. The author taunted the police, writing, "I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I am down on whores, and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled." He claimed to have saved some of the victim's blood to write with, but ended up using red ink, and he signed off with a chilling new moniker. "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." This was the first time the nickname appeared publicly. Initially, police dismissed the letter as a hoax, but after the double murder in which Catherine Eddowes' earlobe was cut, some considered the prediction eerily accurate. A few days later, a postcard known as Saucy Jackie was received by the same agency. Written in similar handwriting, it referred to the double event and boasted that the writer had 2 victims that night. It apologized for not sending the victims' ears as promised, claiming time was short. Perhaps the most disturbing note was the From Hell letter, delivered to George Lusk of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. The Gale blog states that the letter contained a partial kidney, believed to belong to Catherine Eddowes. The writer claimed to have eaten the other half. This letter was unsigned, but the words "From Hell" appeared in the top corner. Modern experts continue to debate its authenticity. The letters spurred copycats. Within days, newspapers worldwide reproduced them, and hoaxers flooded the police with hundreds of similar notes. Such letters drew resources away from the investigation and fueled the legend of a theatrical killer taunting authorities. Police skepticism toward the letters persisted. Sir Charles Warren, head of the Metropolitan Police, concluded that the original Jack the Ripper letter was a journalist's creation. Robert Anderson, Assistant Police Commissioner, later called the correspondence an enterprising journalist's work. Nonetheless, the name Jack the Ripper stuck in the public consciousness, cementing the killer's place in history and popular culture. The investigation and its challenges. The investigation into the Whitechapel murders involved numerous officials. Sir Charles Warren, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, oversaw operations but resigned before the killings ended, due to conflicts with the Home Office and criticism over his handling of public demonstrations. Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline of Scotland Yard was assigned to lead the day-to-day investigation. He had years of experience in Whitechapel and was respected by locals. Aberline interviewed witnesses, coordinated patrols, and followed leads. He believed the killer was a local resident familiar with the area. Sergeant George Godley, Detective Henry Moore, and Inspector Edmund Reed were among the officers who combed the crime scenes. Dr. George Bagster Phillips, the police surgeon for the district, conducted autopsies and provided insights into the killer's methods. Authorities experimented with using bloodhounds to track the murderer, but the dogs became disoriented in the dense urban environment. The Metropolitan Police collaborated with the City of London Police because some murders occurred within the city's jurisdiction. Communication between the two forces was imperfect, leading to duplication of effort and occasional missed opportunities. The Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, organized by local businessmen under George Lusk, hired their own watchmen and offered a reward for information. Their pressure compelled the Home Office to announce a government reward, after initially refusing. Members of the committee sometimes clashed with police, whom they viewed as incompetent or indifferent. The committee's name appears on the From Hell letter, indicating that the writer sought to taunt citizen volunteers as well as the authorities. The press played a central role in shaping public perception of the investigation. Reporters interviewed witnesses, speculated about suspects, and criticized the police for failing to make arrests. Newspapers like The Times, The Star, and the Illustrated Police News competed for attention with sensational headlines. This constant scrutiny led to intense pressure on the police and possibly hasty decisions. At times, officers detained men based solely on vague descriptions, such as wearing a dark coat or carrying a doctor's bag, only to release them when no evidence surfaced. Modern criminologists note that the concept of a serial killer did not exist at the time, so investigators lacked frameworks for linking the murders psychologically. Profiling techniques were rudimentary, focusing on physical clues rather than behavioral patterns. The idea that the murderer could be someone respectable or even a woman challenged Victorian assumptions. Some officers considered that there might be multiple killers, given the differences in modus operandi between the murders. This uncertainty persists today. Victorian detectives faced immense obstacles in identifying the murderer. They lacked modern forensic tools. There was no DNA analysis, fingerprinting, or systematic crime scene preservation. The police determined the pattern of the killings. The murderer lured victims with an offer of payment, sliced their throats, and then mutilated their bodies. Yet officers struggled to gather evidence. Newspapers criticized the police, while citizens formed vigilance committees to patrol the streets. The Whitechapel Vigilance Committee offered monetary rewards and pressed for the resignation of key officials. Law enforcement did, however, recognize certain consistencies. The Ripper targeted women in their 40s or late 20s, who were destitute and often on the streets at night. Each attack occurred in the early morning hours within a mile radius, suggesting the killer knew the area intimately. Witnesses offered conflicting descriptions. Some claimed to have seen a man with a mustache and dark clothing. Others mentioned a foreign accent. One witness, Israel Schwartz, saw a woman, likely Elizabeth Stride, being pushed to the ground by a man shouting, "Lipsky." but he fled when he spotted another man across the street. Nothing came of his testimony. The letters complicated matters further. Police had to read and assess each piece of correspondence, judge its veracity, and, where possible, trace the writer. Meanwhile, the surge of anti-Semitic sentiment following the leather apron rumor led to harassment of local Jewish residents. Immigrant communities feared that scapegoating could lead to violence. Theories and suspects. Additional suspects have surfaced over the years. James Maybrick, a Liverpool cotton merchant, was proposed as the Ripper after a diary purporting to belong to him surfaced in 1992. The diary contained a confession, but many experts consider it a forgery. Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor, was arrested in connection with the murders but released on bail. He was known to have misogynistic tendencies and collected wombs from his medical practice. Tumblety fled to the United States and remained a suspect for decades. Another theory involves Walter Sickert, an artist known for painting scenes of Camden Town prostitutes. Crime novelist Patricia Cornwell argued that Sickert's paintings reflected an obsession with the Ripper crimes and claimed to have found mitochondrial DNA, linking him to some of the letters. However, experts point out that many letters were hoaxes and that Sickert was likely abroad during the murders. The notion that the killer was a woman, sometimes called Jill the Ripper, was supported by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who suggested that a midwife could move around with blood-stained clothes without suspicion. Recent genetic studies have generated headlines. A 2014 analysis of mitochondrial DNA from a shawl purportedly belonging to Catherine Eddowes matched that of descendants of Aaron Kosminski and Eddowes. Critics argue that the chain of custody for the shawl is questionable and that mitochondrial DNA is not unique enough to identify an individual conclusively. The shawl may have been contaminated by many handlers over the years. Nevertheless, the study reignited debate about Kosminski. The persistence of multiple suspects reflects the Ripper case's allure. It functions as a canvas onto which each generation projects its fears and fascinations, be they about class conflict, xenophobia, gender roles, or the dark side of genius. That the murders remain unsolved allows the story to be retold endlessly, each time with a new twist. For more than a century, writers and detectives have proposed theories about Jack the Ripper's identity. Some posited that the killer had surgical training. Others suspected a butcher or slaughterhouse worker, since a butcher would be skilled at removing organs and could walk through Whitechapel, bloodied without arousing suspicion. Some speculated that he may have been a foreign sailor who escaped via London's docks. Yet no single theory has been proven. We will gently explore a few of the most discussed suspects, mindful that each remains unproven. Montague John Druitt. One of the earliest suspects was Montague John Druitt, an Oxford-educated barrister and schoolteacher. He came under suspicion, in part because he drowned himself in the Thames in late 1888. Around the time the murders stopped, a London detective, Melville MacNagdon, listed him among 3 prime suspects in an 1894 report. Druitt had experienced personal turmoil. He was dismissed from a teaching post. His father died and his mother was institutionalized. Some speculators argued that mental breakdown could have driven him to murder. However, there was no evidence linking him to the crime scenes. In our story, his role will remain a shadowy possibility rather than a definitive answer. Aaron Kosminski, and Michael Ostrog. Contemporaries also suspected Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jewish immigrant and barber who lived in Whitechapel. He reportedly exhibited signs of mental illness and misogynistic delusions. Police surveillance followed him for a time. In 1891, he was committed to an asylum where he lived out his life. Modern DNA analysis of a shawl said to belong to Catherine Eddowes suggested a possible match to Kosminski, but the results have been criticized as inconclusive due to contamination. Another suspect was Michael Ostrog, a Russian-born con man and thief who claimed to be a doctor. He spent time in prison and asylums. However, records place him in France during the murders. Both men remain speculative figures rather than confirmed culprits. Carl Feigenbaum. In more recent times, retired detective Trevor Marriott proposed that Carl Feigenbaum, a German sailor, committed the murders. Marriott noted that merchant ships operated from docks near Whitechapel, and that Feigenbaum was a merchant seaman whose ships had been docked near London during the dates of the killings. Feigenbaum was executed in New York in 1894 for murdering Juliana Hoffman. Marriott highlighted similarities between that crime and the Ripper murders and claimed that Feigenbaum's defense attorney had hinted his client was a serial killer. Critics argue that there is no direct evidence placing Feigenbaum in Whitechapel or demonstrating his knowledge of the area, but his case remains an intriguing maritime theory. Prince Albert Victor, Eddie. A sensational theory implicates Prince Albert Victor, the son of King Edward VII and grandson of Queen Victoria. In 1970, physician Thomas Stowell published an article implying that Eddie committed the murders during fits of insanity induced by syphilis. Conspiracy theorists ran with this claim, imagining a royal cover-up. However, official records show that the prince was not near Whitechapel when the murders occurred. This theory continues to fascinate because it connects the lowest rungs of Victorian society to the highest, but credible historians dismiss it. H. Holmes, another suspect. H. Holmes is better known as America's first serial killer. Holmes constructed a labyrinthine murder castle in Chicago and killed numerous victims during the 1893 World's Fair. Some of his descendants and a handful of ripperologists speculate that he traveled to London in 1888 and committed the Ripper murders. Holmes's great-great-grandson, Jeff Mudgett, has suggested involvement based on diaries. Yet there is no evidence connecting Holmes to London, and most experts consider this theory unlikely. Robert Mann. Historian Maytreau has proposed Robert Mann, an attendant at Whitechapel's mortuary, as the killer. Mann was present when Polly Nichols's body arrived at the morgue and reportedly undressed her, which some viewed as unusual for his role. Trow argues that Mann fits psychological profiles of the Ripper. He had a low socioeconomic status and regular contact with corpses. Yet there is little evidence beyond suspicion, and no eyewitnesses place him at crime scenes. Other theories and the concept of a butcher or surgeon. Beyond named suspects, some theories suggest that the killer was a butcher or slaughterhouse worker, given the anatomical precision of the organ removal and the ease with which such a person could walk bloodied through the streets without raising alarm. Others propose a foreign sailor who could disappear quickly on a vessel. Still others have speculated that the murderer was a woman, a midwife able to move freely at odd hours and avoid suspicion. None of these theories have been proven, and each reflects the anxieties of Victorian society about class, gender, and ethnicity. Indeed, as historian Hallie Rubenhold argues, the focus on the killer's identity has often eclipsed the lives of his victims. Legacy and cultural impact. Jack the Ripper's crimes had a profound cultural impact. They contributed to the birth of the term serial killer, though that phrase would not be coined until the late 20th century. The case inspired Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories, which feature masterful detectives solving seemingly impossible crimes. Films like Alfred Hitchcock's The Lodger and numerous television adaptations depict the gaslit streets and brooding killer. Victorian moral reformers used the murders to campaign for housing and social reforms, arguing that poverty creates breeding grounds for crime. Feminists highlighted the vulnerability of women and the failure of authorities to protect them. Ripper tourism emerged in the 20th century. Guided tours take visitors through Whitechapel's remaining lanes, stopping at points associated with each murder. Museums display artifacts, such as the letters and period newspapers. The case has become a commercial commodity, raising ethical questions about profiting from tragedy. At the same time, true crime media has exploded in popularity. Podcasts, documentaries, and books dissect the case, offering listeners a sense of participation in solving a mystery. This fascination speaks to a broader human desire to understand evil and impose narrative order on chaos. It also reflects a cultural shift toward empathy for victims and an emphasis on social context rather than salacious detail. The murders also influenced policing methods. The failure to catch the killer led to reforms in record-keeping, communication between police districts, and the use of fingerprints, which were introduced in the early 20th century. Criminologists now study the case to understand how media pressure can shape investigations and how public fear can both hinder and galvanize law enforcement. Whitechapel has changed dramatically since 1888, with redevelopment and gentrification altering the landscape. Yet, the shadow of the Ripper lingers, a reminder of the intersection between social inequality and violent crime. The murders attributed to Jack the Ripper ceased with Mary Jane Kelly's death, but the fascination with the case never ended. The ongoing case has spawned an industry of books, films, television series, and tours. More than 100 suspects have been named, and new theories emerge regularly. The murders also spark discussions about urban poverty, policing, and violence against women. Contemporary feminist scholars emphasize that the victims were women living in a patriarchal society that failed to protect them. Modern DNA research has produced tantalizing hints but no definitive answer. The physical environment where the murders occurred has changed. Many of the buildings that line the narrow lanes of Whitechapel have been replaced. Yet if you visit London today, you can still walk along some of the same streets. Guided tours point out the sites of the murders, and visitors imagine the gaslit alleys of 1888. The figure of Jack the Ripper has become a symbol of the unknown serial killer, a trope repeated in literature and film. But as we close this story, it is important to remember not the murderer's mystique, but the lives of his victims: Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. Women who faced poverty and hardship and whose stories deserve compassion. Conclusion: drifting away. Reflecting on this expanded journey, we can see how Jack the Ripper's story encompasses more than a series of crimes. It illustrates the intersections of poverty, gender, immigration, media, and law enforcement. It also challenges us to consider how we tell stories about violence without glorifying it. As you listen to this narrative in the stillness of your bedroom, let the complexities of Victorian London fade into a gentle blur. Picture the lives of Mary Ann, Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, and Mary Jane, not only in their final moments but throughout their years of struggle and resilience. Imagine them laughing with friends, caring for children, dreaming of better days. Their humanity transcends the horror inflicted upon them. In your mind's eye, watch the fog rolling down Whitechapel's cobblestones one last time. The gas lamps flicker, then dim. Footsteps grow faint. The whispers of the past recede. Allow yourself to drift with the mist into a tranquil sleep, free from fear. The mystery endures, but tonight, you have explored it thoroughly. Let your breath slow and your muscles relax. Tomorrow you may revisit these streets with curiosity or leave them behind. For now, rest in the knowledge that you have honored the memory of those whose stories we often overlook. As our journey through foggy Victorian London comes to an end, breathe deeply. Visualize the cobblestone streets now bathed in moonlight, the lamplight flickering softly. Hear the distant clatter of carriage wheels and the muted calls of vendors. Imagine the residents of Whitechapel gradually returning to their routines after the autumn of fear, carrying on despite the uncertainty. The identity of Jack the Ripper remains a mystery, and perhaps it always will. What remains certain is the resilience of those who survived and the humanity of those lost. Allow this sense of unresolved mystery and gentle remembrance to lull you into rest. Let your thoughts wander like the mist through London's alleys, drifting from one scene to the next. Soon you will be asleep, wrapped in the comfort of your bed, far from the shadows of history. Good night, my friends. Sleep tight.